U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, what we know as ICE, didn't start in 2003. No, it started back in 1789, before his immigration enforcement, before it's controversial, before it even had a badge. ICE's story started with something far less dramatic: money, tariffs, smuggling, ships full of taxable stuff. ICE didn't just appear after 9/11. It's the result of two completely different government systems: customs enforcement and immigration control, slowly crashing into each other over more than 200 years. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you a couple different things: what ICE actually replaced, why the government split immigration into three separate agencies, and how an agency that started by counting cargo became one of the most powerful law enforcement organizations in the country. And it all starts back in 1789, when the US government needed cash, and customs officers were basically the IRS with boats.
To comprehend the history of a thing is to unlock the mysteries of its present.
When the United States was founded, the federal government had a problem. It had no income tax. It had to collect revenue. So instead, it funded itself through customs duties, taxes on goods coming into American ports. That meant customs officers were some of the first federal employees ever hired. Their job: inspect ships, collect tariffs, and stop smugglers. And here's the key part: customs enforcement was law enforcement from day one. By the 1800s, customs officers weren't just checking paperwork. They were seizing cargo, making arrests, and investigating smuggling networks. Fast forward all the way to the 20th century, and the U.S. Customs Service had evolved into a full-blown federal investigative agency handling drug trafficking, money laundering, trade fraud, and international smuggling rings. This law enforcement DNA will matter a lot later. But that's just customs. Now let's talk about the immigration part of the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement. This is interesting because for most of the US history, immigration wasn't even a federal issue. States handled it until the late 1800s, when Congress stepped in. At first, immigration enforcement wasn't about crime or security. It was about labor markets, public health, and economic regulation. Immigration agencies bounced between departments like a bureaucratic hot potato: Treasury, Commerce, Labor, before landing in the Department of Justice in 1940. That move changed everything. Immigration enforcement was now officially linked to law enforcement and national security. In 1933, the government created the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, a single agency responsible for processing visas, granting citizenship, arresting people, detaining people, deporting people, which brings us to a huge problem. INS was expected to do customer service and law enforcement at the same time. One agency, two opposite jobs. On one side of the building, it was "Welcome to America, here's your paperwork." On the other side, you're under arrest. This internal contradiction caused decades of dysfunction, conflicting priorities, poor accountability, and constant criticism from all sides. But the system limped along until something broke it completely. What broke it? Well, that was 9/11. After September 11th, 2001, the US government decided the entire system needed to be rebuilt. Congress created the Department of Homeland Security, the biggest federal reorganization since World War II. INS was dissolved, and its responsibilities were split into three separate agencies. USCIS handles immigration benefits, CBP controls borders and ports of entry, and ICE handles interior enforcement and investigations. ICE officially launched in 2003, pulling together immigration enforcement officers from INS and criminal investigators from the US Customs Service. At first, it was literally called the Bureau of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which tells you how experimental this whole thing still was. Even after its creation, ICE struggled with its identity. So in 2010, the agency reorganized itself into two clear missions. First, Homeland Security Investigations, or HSI. These are criminal investigators who work cases involving human trafficking, drug and weapons smuggling, financial crimes, child exploitation, and cybercrime. The second mission was Enforcement and Removal Operations, or ERO. This side handles arrests, detentions, deportations, and this clears up a major misconception about ICE. ICE is not Border Patrol. ICE does not process visas. ICE operates inside the country after someone has already entered. By the mid-2010s, ICE had finally figured out what it was, and Congress made something very clear: they are willing to pay for it. Since 2015, ICE's budget has grown dramatically, by more than 60% in less than a decade. In raw numbers, that's a jump from roughly $6 billion a year to nearly $10 billion a year. But here's the important part: that growth in their budget didn't come from ICE inventing new powers. It came from doing much more of what it already did: more detention beds, more transportation contracts, more court cases, more investigations that take years instead of months. Budgets aren't just accounting documents, they're mission signals. And ICE's budget growth reflects three things: expanded detention and removal operations, increasingly complex transnational crime investigations, and rising legal and compliance costs. In other words, ICE didn't become bigger because Congress rewrote the law. It became bigger because the government kept asking it to do more, faster, and at a larger scale. And this is where ICE's history catches up with it, because ICE sits at the intersection of immigration policy, criminal law, civil liberties, and national politics. That makes controversy almost inevitable. Over the years, ICE has faced repeated scandals and criticisms, including detention conditions and overcrowding, use of private detention contractors, deaths in custody, workplace raids that swept up non-criminal immigrants, accusations of overreach, misconduct, and poor oversight, and items that are occurring today. At different moments, watchdog reports, inspector generals, and courts have all raised concerns about how ICE carries out its mission. What's important to understand is this: these controversies don't come from nowhere, they emerge from ICE's design. ICE was built to be a law enforcement agency operating inside this country and enforcing civil law with criminal tools. Under all of this is intense political pressure from every single direction, and that's a volatile mix. Some administrations have pushed ICE to expand enforcement aggressively. Others try to rein it in. The agency itself stays, but the expectations swing wildly. And because these expectations swing wildly, ICE never stops being debated. So when people argue about ICE today, they're not just arguing about one agency. They're arguing about how immigration law should be enforced, how much discretion law enforcement should have, and where the line between security and civil rights should be drawn. ICE is controversial not because it's new, but because it's old. It carries 2 centuries of customs enforcement, a century of immigration control, and a post 9/11 mandate that never fully settled. That's why debates about ICE never really go away. They're baked into the institution itself, because ICE isn't just enforcing the law, it's enforcing the unresolved compromises of American history. If you like this background on ICE, if you thought it was important, please make sure to hit like. If you got any questions, comment. We try to answer every single question, respond to every single comment, so put them down below. And make sure to subscribe, like, it really helps our channel. Thanks for watching.